Good evening, everyone. We are going to continue our conversation on Middot. And tonight we're going to talk about what I'm going to categorize as educational Middot. You'll see why. And I want to start with this because it actually sets a really good framework for how we're going to understand Middot. Because Middot are not just about spirit and spirituality. See, in Judaism, spirituality isn't divorced from practice and from our actions. It's one of the reasons why we have a lot of young people. They're like, well, Judaism isn't spiritual enough for me. I want to go into Buddhism or go into all these different sorts of things where you sort of get your spiritual package as a separate unit, right? You have your regular day and then you have your spiritual moments. Judaism isn't like that. Judaism mixes the practical and the spiritual together, and midot are actually a way of seeing the practical world through a spiritual lens. So we will for sure be talking about spiritual attributes and aspects, but I wanted to start with something a little bit more practical so we understand a little bit what's going on. Okay, let's begin. Once again, I'm going to just encourage people to, if you have a question, please raise your hand. I'm going to keep everybody on mute. Raise your hand, and then you can unmute yourself. Raise your electronic hand, because first of all, some of you, I can't see you because you don't have your cameras on, so I definitely won't see you. But even if I can see you, you're not all in a place on the page where I can see you. So if you go to reactions, you'll see there that there's a place where you can click the button for raise hand. All right, let's begin. So what I want to talk to you today about are the 48 midot of Torah acquisition, right? And we're going to actually see this comes from Pirkei Avot, from a section of the Mishnah. We were just having a conversation about that. The Mishnah was finished in the year 200. There are 6 chapters of Pirkei Avot. The first 5 were part of the original Mishnah. Most scholars think the 6th chapter was actually added a bit later, but still has very much the same quality and same ideas. But it's much more expansive. And it feels different. The last chapter feels different. Pirkei Avot focuses on 2 things when we study it. We're coming up to the time of year that we normally study it. It's usually studied in between Passover and Shavuot on the Saturday afternoons, right? That's traditionally when we study Pirkei Avot. There are 6 Shabbatot in between those, and you take 1 chapter each week. And I've done that before, where we've after synagogue, after services, where we go and we'll study some of Pirkei Avot during that time period as well. The first thing that we see in Pirkei Avot is it's actually a systematic exploration of how things were transmitted, literally generation to generation, right? You can create, for lack of a better term, family trees of rabbis, of teacher to student, and how things were being passed by studying Pirkei Avot. This and Eduyot. There's 2 different Masechtot, 2 different tractates that do the same thing. But what most people know it for is for the moral and ethical sayings and values that it brings. Much of the Mishnah is legal in nature. Pirkei Avot is all about values and sayings, the world stands on 3 things: on worship, on learning, and on acts of kindness, right? So those are the types of sayings we see and we find in Pirkei Avot. And so we look at Pirkei Avot 6:6, and we see them actually having a conversation, and they're trying to decide which is better: learning, the priesthood, or royalty. right? And the argument that Pirkei Avot says is Torah learning is greater than either the priesthood or royalty, because you can acquire royalty in 30 different ways. And there's a list somewhere. Doesn't really concern us, since none of us are trying to be king or queen. And the priesthood, right? There are 24 different ways. But the Torah is acquired by 48 different ways, in 48 different ways, in 48 things. Now, what's interesting, and I didn't share this with you intentionally last time, the chart that I shared with you last time comes from Pirkei Avot 6:6. These are the 48 ways that Torah is acquired. So, in a sense, all of these are educational midot, because they all focus us on how do we gain knowledge? How do we gain Torah? Some of the others that we're going to see are not necessarily about Torah, it's about life in general. But these all are from Pirkei Avot, and there's a list, right? If you study Pirkei Avot, it's a long Mishnah, and all of these are in that list. So today we're going to look at some of them. We are not going to look at all 48. We're going to look at some, and I'm going to bring you some other sources as well, because for those who have learned with me before, you know that's what I like to do. I love sources. I'm a very source-based teacher. So why we learn, right? Two of the midot that are there actually are, right, learning in order to teach or learning in order to do, right? Those are two different ways that Torah learning is sort of acquired. We focus on it because we want to teach something, or we focus on it because we want to do something. And I'm actually calling this purposeful learning, right? There's a reason behind why it is that we are learning something. Elsewhere in Pirkei Avot, chapter 4, Mishnah 5, it reads, Rabbi Ishmael, his son, said, he who learns in order to teach, it is granted to him to study and to teach. But he who learns in order to practice, it is granted to him to learn and teach and practice. So Rabbi Ishmael is saying, look, if you have to choose between the two of them, learn in order to do. Because you get three benefits from that, not just two, right? If you're learning to teach, yeah, you learn it for yourself and you learn it so you can teach. But if you're learning because you yourself want to do, then you're going to learn it, you're going to do it, and then you know it well enough, yeah, you can go teach that as well. It comes as part of it. Elsewhere in Avot, since we were there, I decided to take a couple of different sections from it. There are four types among those who frequent the study house, the Beit Midrash. One who attends but does not practice, he receives award for his attendance. One who practices but does not attend, he receives his reward for practice. One who attends and practices, this is a pious person, and one who neither attends nor practices, that is a wicked person. Pirkei Avot loves to divide things into four and create that, the little, I forget what it's called. I know there's a logic name for it. When you create four, you've got two different possibilities and four total combinations. So again, we see that, yeah, this is a little bit different. If you practice, if you do things, that's good. If you learn, that's good. You get it. But if you do both, if you go to the school and you learn and then you practice, that's what we should be striving for. what we're starting to see in this, I hope, is it's not just about the action, but it's sort of the mindset behind the action. And that's what Middot are going to help us with, right? How do I get myself to a place where I'm in synagogue and my head, my heart, my soul are ready to pray, right? I can be there because, okay, it's 6 o'clock and it's minyan and I have to daven. That's action. But am I engaged in it? Do I have that spiritual component? And that's what this is sort of, these midot are going to help us bring that spirit to the rituals and the things that we do. The Babylonian Talmud in Yevamot writes as follows. One who says that he has only the study of Torah, he only has reward for the study of Torah. Pshita, this is obvious, right? Rather, he doesn't even have the reward for the study of Torah, right? Why? What's the proof? Rav Papa said that you may learn them to do them in Deuteronomy, right? Lilmod la'asot, right? Ulamadatem va'asitem. You shall learn them and deal them and do them. One who is engaged in doing the commandments is regarded as engaged in learning. But one who is not engaged in doing is not regarded as engaged in learning them. So this idea of learning by itself, there seems to be a push against that within Judaism, at least until I flip it on you in a few slides, right? There seems, right, when we're talking about purposeful learning, there's a reason. We're learning so that we can be better Jews, so that we can be better human beings. We're not just learning yet. Any questions so far? Rabbi Shem Tov, Ibn Shem Tov, a more modern rabbi, obviously Sephardi, because he is Shem Tov, the son of Shem Tov, that's in the Sephardi world. He wrote as follows: you cannot compare the one who learns medicine merely to have the knowledge with the one who studies it to make it his occupation and cure the sick. For the first will little heed if he makes an error, while the one who would engage in its practice must be alert and aware, forgetting nothing, altering nothing. It's a wonderful way of thinking about this, right? Sometimes we say, well, knowledge just for knowledge's sake. Yeah, but do you really care about your knowledge if there isn't a reason for it? If there's a reason, you're going to care much more because you need to get it right. Maybe you have to pass an exam. Maybe you're doing this for your occupation. Maybe you're doing this because you need to teach somebody else. And if they learn it wrong, then it's going to reflect back, right? There's all of these, there's a reason for it. So this is purposeful learning, and there's a very strong sense of that within our tradition. However, it's not the only way we as Jews learn. We have something called Torah Lishma, which literally means Torah for its own sake or for its own name. And we see a couple of sources that teach us about this idea. The first is in the Babylonian Talmud in Tractate Sukkah 49b. Rabbi Elazar said, what is the significance of the verse? Piha potcha bechachma v'toras chesed al lashona. She opens her mouth with wisdom, and the Torah of loving kindness is on her tongue. Is there a Torah of loving kindness and another Torah not of loving kindness, right? How do we derive this designation? What the verse means is that Torah studied for its own sake is a Torah of loving kindness, while Torah studied not for its own sake or an ulterior motive is a Torah not of loving kindness. So here we have a source that seems to push in the opposite direction, to say that the ideal isn't learning for a purpose, but it's Torah lishma, Torah just for the joy of studying Torah. Tanit takes it even further. He who occupies himself with Torah for its own sake, Torah lishma, the Torah he masters becomes sam chayim, an elixir of life for him. But he who occupies with Torah shelo lishma, not for its own sake, the Torah becomes sam hamavet, a deadly poison. Right? So according to Rabbi Bena'a, it's actually not just neutral, it's actually negative to not study Torah, negative to not. I know I'm using a double negative there, but it's a negative if you don't study Torah for its own sake, and you are just studying it for a particular purpose. So obviously the question is, which is better, right? How do we decide which way we go? Masechet Pesachim reads as follows. Rav Yehuda said, a person should always busy himself with Torah and mitzvot, even though it is not lishma, for its own sake, but from being not lishma, it will become lishma. In other words, we start at a place of learning for a purpose, but eventually it becomes a joy. It becomes something we want to do, even if we don't have to anymore, right? And that's the joy of Torah study. There are a number of people here, Diana and Peter and Tom and Hillary, a number, and the Cullies that are in my Beit Midrash class. That's what we do, right? We study for the joy of studying. There's no ulterior motive. Sometimes we talk about the most esoteric things that we'll never, ever talk about again. And sometimes we're talking about very practical stuff. Like whether or not you can drive an electric car on Shabbat, which is what we just finished a unit on. But the idea is you start with a purpose. You start by saying, I want to learn Judaism because I want to convert to Judaism. Great. Or I want to learn Judaism because I feel disconnected and I want to go back and learn more of my heritage. It's been a long time. Great. But eventually, hopefully, we get to a place where it becomes a love. I want to learn Judaism just because I love doing it. Right? And we see that in other things, right? I know somebody, somebody who plays tennis, and when she started playing tennis, it was like I started playing tennis because I needed to lose weight. Now I play tennis because I love it. Yeah, that's the same thing we're talking about here. Any questions on why we learn? For a purpose, for not a purpose. And we see how these midot of teaching in order, and you'll see both of them there. Teaching in order to teach, teaching in order to or learning in order to teach, learning in order to practice, are both there. Brooks or Joanna, I'm not sure.
Yeah, it's Brooks. Rabbi, what would the Haredi who are studying all day, where do they see themselves, and what would other people see them who are doing that kind of intensive study?
Yeah, so I think they would argue they're doing both, right? They're doing both. I'm sure there's some of their learning that they would say has a practical purpose, right? For day-to-day living and how they should live their life as Jews, and they're learning to be better Jews that way. And some of their learning is for this joy of learning. And they're doing both, I would argue. I think the difference, is how we would define a practical purpose. They may define practical purpose differently than you or I would define a practical purpose.
Right. That's what I was trying to get at.
But for them, there is a practical purpose. Diana.
I think it's hard for me to sort of wrap my head around not learning for any purpose at all, because I probably spend an hour and a half to 2 hours a day learning between the Torah study, the gazillion podcasts that I listen to every week. And I always feel that there's a purpose, because there's always that nafkamina. Like, I always ask myself at the end, like, so what? In other words, how does this apply to me today, right now? And it's like a continuum, and it changes the way I think, it changes the way I act, it changes the way I perceive. So even if I think at the onset, oh, there's no purpose, there's always a purpose.
So I hear what you're saying, and the way I'll push back on that is to say, I think it depends when you ask the question. If you ask the
Okay,
question
that's
at the
fair.
end, then it still could very well be Torah Lishma, right? And now you're finding a purpose to the learning that you just did. Or if you're going to say, well, why should I study this? Right? You don't ask yourself, why should I study this? You study, and I know you study because you love to study, right? It brings you nachas, it brings you joy. Then you ask yourself, okay, what can I learn from this? I think that's a reasonable question. But that's different than when I was in rabbinical school and I was studying this stuff because I had to pass exams. And I had to be able to teach other people, right? There was a reason that I was learning this, or any other purpose-driven learning that we do, right? The closest thing that I could say is, if you are in the medical profession or if you are in the legal profession, a lot of times you have, in order to keep your license current, you have to take continuing education of some sort, right? In order to keep your license current. And there's two ways to sort of go into that, right? One mindset is, all right, I got to do this so that I can keep my license current. The other way is, I do this because I want to keep being the best doctor I can be, right? The second is lishma. The first is purpose-driven, in my mind. Tom.
Great. Hi, Rabbi. Question. I mean, there's so many ways we can learn. We can learn from a podcast. We can learn in person with a teacher and a rabbi or a group, or we can do our own individual Torah study. And I don't see any of that really discussed here. Is there any particular distinction between those that would come into this conversation?
So there's going to be two responses, right? A more traditional response is, you should always learn with somebody, right? Because you're always going to gain something when you're studying with somebody else, and Jewish learning is meant to be in a chavruta.
Yeah.
That's a more traditional response. But a less traditional response, and I think an equally valid response, is you need to learn in the way that's best for you, right? I don't do daf yomi in a chavruta, right? Because I don't have the time to do it. I'm not going to be able to set it up. It's more efficient for me to be able to go through it on my own. There are other things that I do learn in chavruta, right? When I'm studying for other things, I've been studying for the Gittin program, the divorce program that I'm learning in and stuff like that, I'm studying with a partner in order to do that. I think it sort of depends on what's best for you at the moment.
Okay, great. Thank you.
All right. Any other questions about that before we go on to our next conversation? I think it was actually Layla that had asked me last time. I don't know if she's here. I don't see everybody on my list here. But if not, this is being recorded. So when we looked at the list last time, there were a lot of things on the list that were about limiting activities, right? Limiting sleep, limiting conversation, limiting work and business, limiting levity, limiting pleasure, and limiting mundane activities. All of these are on this list of 48 Middot on how to acquire Torah. And Judaism is not traditionally an ascetic religion, right? Where we limit pleasures and avoid those sorts of things. We're not about separating ourselves off. We're not about being a monk somewhere and never speaking. That's not our shtick, right? That's not what we do. We enjoy, we eat, we drink, we celebrate. We just had Purim, for God's sakes, right? I mean, so that's not who we are. So when we look at this list of limiting, it's a little confusing. It's a little confusing. And What we need to understand is the limiting is within the context of acquiring Torah and learning. And what are we dealing with here? We're dealing with a concept called bitul Torah. Bitul Torah. Bitul Torah literally means nullification of Torah, right? And what it means is wasted time, right? For anybody who's ever been on a subway in New York, right? You can spend a lot of time on subways in New York. If you've ever looked at the Orthodox Jews, very often they will be reading something while they're on there. Now, there's two reasons for that. One is very likely some modesty issues because the people that are around them maybe are not dressed appropriately. They don't want to be looking around. So that's a reason to kind of keep your nose in a book. But the real reason is they don't want to be sitting there wasting time. They could be learning Torah. Because the sin of bitul Torah, of wasting Torah time, is a big one. And so when we look at these limiting activities, I want to go back to it for a second. These are things that kind of take us away potentially from learning Torah. And if the goal is Torah acquisition, too much sleep, well, that's hours that you could be spending learning Torah. No, and conversation isn't just any conversation. Conversation is mundane conversation. Obviously, if you're arguing with your chavruta over a fine point of Jewish law, that's great. That's a great conversation to be having. You should spend hours doing that, right? Work or business is required. So is conversation. So is sleep. So is levity and pleasure and mundane activities. All of these are things that are required, but we should watch how much time we're spending with that and what we could be doing elsewhere. And part of Middot, part of understanding our spiritual selves is to understand that the rhythms that we have set up for ourselves are usually based on our physical desires and needs, and not always on our spiritual ones. So when we get into a practice of limiting certain things, it minimally makes us more aware, and in the best of terms, can actually give us more opportunities to develop our spiritual selves. That's where this is coming from. So let's talk a little bit about Bitul Torah and where it comes from. Chagiga, the Babylonian Talmud in Chagiga, Rabbi Levi says, anyone who pauses from words of Torah to occupy himself with a mundane conversation will be fed with the coals of the broom tree. I'm not entirely sure what a broom tree is. It's a tree, but I'm not entirely sure what that is. As it is stated, and this is from Job, they pluck saltwort, maluach, with wormwood, alesiach, and the roots of the broom tree, the retamim, are their foods. So how is this a proof text? That's why you have the little explanation that follows. Those who pluck, that is, pause from learning, which was given upon the tablets, which are luchot. Luchot and maluach sound similar, with the purpose of siach, idle chatter, or sicha, actually, in this case, right? Siach is the tree, and sicha is idle chatter. They're punished by eating the coals made from the roots of the broom tree. That's how they derive this. But the idea behind this is it's a bad thing, according to Rabbi Levi, right? To even bring in a mundane conversation while you are studying Torah. Sanhedrin says it very clearly. Rabbi Nehorai says anyone for whom it is possible to engage in Torah and nevertheless does not engage in its study is included in the category of because he has despised the word of God. But this action of wasting Torah time of bitul Torah is like despising God. And Avot Rabbi Natan reads, anyone who commits himself to studying words of Torah becomes surrounded by a circle of committed colleagues. And anyone who neglects studying words of Torah becomes surrounded by a circle of neglectful companions. I like this because it not only talks about our idea, but it sort of shows like the people you hang out with are going to shape you. And what you do with them shapes the people that you hang out with. And I think it's a very wise sort of way of looking at it. Peter, you have a question?
It's a juniper tree.
Thank you for looking it up.
The broom tree was known for its qualities of shade, fragrant, and lasting embers, and beautiful white blooms. In short, it was a tree of rest, renewal, and hope.
All right. So I like that. So that's an even more powerful image, because you take the tree of hope, reduce it to ashes, and have to eat it. Right? It's a powerful symbol. Thank you, Peter. I like that. Barb.
It's Neil, and I'm
hi, Neil. Go ahead.
To which I'm sorry. Who are they referring to as studying? Who's allowed to study the Torah? I suppose. For example,
Everybody.
in this age, were women allowed to study the Torah?
So yes and no, right?
So everybody.
So everyone can study Torah. Women didn't study Torah directly in the same. Women didn't study Torah in the way that men study Torah, right? Women study Torah in a more oral tradition of being passed down from mothers to daughters. But women still, like, women have to know the laws of Shabbat. They're the ones making the house. Women have to know all the laws of kashrut, right? My wife knows better than I do. She knows the kitchen better than I do. She knows the laws of kashrut better than I do, right? And so it was just taught in a different way, but the expectation of learning Torah was still there, both for men and women.
But that statement says implies that women study Torah because they need to know the laws so they can practice them instead of studying for the sake of studying Torah on its own.
No, women are allowed to study Lishma on their own also. They just do it differently. Right? It's the tactics that are different, not the end results, not the mission.
Not the philosophy behind it.
Right. Good questions, guys. So any other questions in terms of the limiting activities? I wanted to address them because last week when some people saw them, they're like, what is all this limiting stuff? Why do we limit ourselves? The idea it's not about limiting and eliminating. It's about watching how much of that, what is our balance state, right? How much time are we spending in work, and how much time are we spending in nurturing our spiritual selves? Any questions on that? Diana?
It's not a question, it's just a statement that just how fortunate we are, and I think I've probably said this a gazillion times, but to have so much access to learning, it's just amazing. And the Torah, they say one of the questions you're asked in heaven is, did you set aside a fixed time for Torah study every day? And so besides, like, people say, well, how do you do it? I say, well, I got to take my dog for a walk. So when I walk Sasha, it's about a 15-minute walk. I put my AirPods in. I listen to maybe a 25-minute podcast on 1.5 speed. And boom, there's a fixed time. That's the thing. It's just so incredibly accessible. And especially with all the videos. It's infinite. And that's what can be overwhelming.
There is almost no book that we don't have access to now. And I have access to it all sitting in my sitting right here in my on my computer. I can't do it. Diana, will you just put Safaria into the chat? For those who are unaware of
Absolutely.
Sefaria, it is free. It is a website that gives you access to pretty much any piece of rabbinic literature you could ever want, and hundreds that you never even knew about.
And
Now,
I'm going to put my number on there too. I'm happy to walk anybody through Safari and do a little, if you're okay with, do a little tutorial if anybody wants.
yeah,
Okay.
sure. Now, much of it has not been translated yet. So obviously you need to have Hebrew, but a lot of it is translated, right? All of the major books are translated.
And you can pick your translation. Like I'm
Yeah.
partial to Koren. Rabbi Ern likes JPS. I forget which version it is, but that's the one he likes. So there's, I'm like I said, it'd be my absolute pleasure to walk anybody through it.
Yep. Yeah. Thank you, Rona.
I find myself bristling a little bit or arguing, and it's because of the black and white nature of these statements. It's an either or.
Mm-hmm.
And my favorite English word is balance. So I understand the concept of teaching this and learning this way, but it offends my sense of there is some gray and there is some balance in these concepts.
So the rabbis very rarely, I'm going to take a step back. Rabbinic Judaism is actually one of the most balanced systems of living that I have ever encountered in my life, right? That being said, rabbinic statements are almost never balanced themselves, because the way rabbinic Judaism balances is by bringing different statements together. So you're going to have, that's why we sort of had at the same time, we started with that, right? We had the way to do this is purposeful learning. No, the way to do this is Torah Lishma. Well, you need a balance, of course. You have both of those statements that are there. So, we have this idea of Bitul Torah that you should limit all of that, but our tradition also says Im en kemach ein Torah, right? If you don't have flour, you don't have Torah. Like, you have to work. You have to make a living. And so the balance is there. It's just not always there in a single statement. And it's almost, I would actually go so far as to say it's almost never there in a single statement. Because the rabbis like to make very clear statements. And then they'll take Rabbi A and Rabbi B and say, okay, now, right, we have to measure both of them. But I agree with you. Okay. These are good questions, and that segues right into our next midah, asking questions. Actually, the way that it's stated in Pirkei Avot is shoel umeshiv, right? That a person asks and answers. So it's not just about asking questions, it's about answering questions. In other words, it's about engaging with questions, right? And if we think about it, we look at the Shema, we look at the very first page of the Talmud, right? Brachot 2a. We should already be asking a question. Why does the first page start on number 2? Right? That's so typically Jewish. But the very first page of the first Masechet of Talmud, the first words are Me'ematai korin et hashma ba'aravit. From what time may one recite the Shema in the evening? All of Jewish learning starts with a question. We're coming up on Passover, folks. It's all about questions, right? Exodus 12, verses 26 and 27. And when your children ask you, what do you mean by this rite? You shall say, it's the Passover sacrifice to Adonai, who passed over the houses of the Israelites in Egypt and smiting the Egyptians, but saved our houses. We start with questions. One of my favorite stories about a modern character, and it's in a number of different places. I found it in the New York Times. I found it in one of the Haggadot. It's actually a story about Isidore Rabi, who is a Nobel physicist. And when he was asked why he became a scientist, his answer is as follows: my mother made me a scientist without ever intending it. Every other Jewish mother in Brooklyn would ask her child after school, "So, did you learn anything today?" But not my mother. She always asked me a different question. "Izzy," she would say, "did you ask a good question today?" That's the difference, asking good questions. Right? So this idea of engaging with questions is at the heart of what it means to acquire Torah. And it should challenge us, and it should make us think, and it should bristle us like it did for Rona, right? That's exactly what is supposed to happen when we're engaging with this stuff. And that's the spiritual side, because everything we're talking about is about how we feel, not about what we know. It's not about the knowledge. It's about, does it make us good people? Does it sit right with me? Is that the way the world is supposed to be? Right? And well, if it's not, well, what does it teach me? What does it teach me? Right? About finding balance in two different places as opposed to in one place. We could talk about that. We could have a full hour class on that and delve into what that might mean. That's Jewish learning. And that's Jewish spiritual learning. March. Sorry, March, you're muted.
Are
There you
you,
go.
are you saying then that when the rabbis gave absolutes, they didn't intend for the absolute to be absolute?
Look, no and yes. I'm going to give you an absolute maybe. So there are always absolutes, and then there are always exceptions to the absolutes, right? It is the law to stop at a red light. Well, can you pass through a red light if there's an ambulance behind you that's trying to get through? Yeah. So absolutes are not always absolute. I mean, the reality is the only absolutes is God's word. Everything else is contextual to some degree. That's not to say that there aren't things that in our existence seem like absolute, but they may be, just because we never are going to come up to a situation where that's going to be different.
Yeah, well, that makes a lot of sense. But I'm just wondering when the rabbis were doing these discussions, that they had the sense that their absolutes weren't really absolute. So they themselves kind of knew that there would be this broader way.
Yes, I think they did. I think they did, because it's almost like you're in a debate. For anybody who's ever been in a debate, right? You know, you pick a side, and the whole point is to have the conversation. So you may not always agree with everything that you're saying, but you're going to take your argument to its logical conclusion, so that you can say, here's the argument. Now let's poke holes in it. And I think that's a very human thing to do. Anybody who knows Robert's Rules of Order really, really well knows that, a lot of times somebody who knows Robert's Rules of Order and wants to overturn something is actually going to make a motion that they disagree with so they can actually talk about it. Right? That's an advanced Robert Rules of Order strategy. Right? Otherwise, how does it get on the agenda? How do you deal with that? So you make a motion that you're actually going to vote against, but you make it so you can talk about it, and then once it's on the table, now you can talk about it, and you're going to say, well, here are all the problems with my motion, right? But now it's on the table, so you can talk about it. I think that's a very natural sort of human way in which we engage in the dialectical process.
So again, that makes a lot of intellectual sense, but do we have any indication from the rabbis that that's how they were looking at it?
Yes, because if they would have only wanted the absolute, they never would have kept majority opinions. I'm sorry, minority opinions.
That makes sense.
Right? There's no need for a minority opinion other than to show that there's a process.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah.
Peter, I'm going to take off the share because hold on, I'm just going to say questions. Next week we're going to talk about spiritual Middot, and I'm going to take this off so we can actually see each other a little bit better. Go ahead, Peter.
But that became the foundation of what Karl Marx did with the dialectic process. You have two synthesis, and you have two competing ideas. And I think that we're sitting there with the animal soul and the godly soul constantly in competition with each other for our attention, our time, and our efforts in life. And the only time you resolve them is on the moment of death. So it's very, very deep. But I think it's also part of a Jewish DNA, see, that this is part of who we are.
100%. Karl Marx probably got that from his grandfather.
You bet. But that whole dialectic process is Judaism.
I agree.
Everything is always in a state of argument and competition.
I agree.
Two poles.
I agree. Any other questions? All right. Well, we have a few more classes. We will be taking a break as we get into Passover, but we have a few weeks until we get there. So next week, we're going to be starting to talk about some of the more traditional spiritual midot that are really the basis of Musar literature and the Musar movement, right? That we spoke about. This was from a particular Mishnah in Pirkei Avot that we talked about today. These are called Middot as well. So it made sense to talk about them, but now we're going to really move into the more spiritual side of things over the next couple of weeks. All right. Have a wonderful week, a safe week, and I look forward to seeing you next week, if not before.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Bye all.
Bye.